and also from his experience as a labor negotiator and other experiences as governor of California, that the longer he played for the time, the better deal he would get. And so the deal he finally got was a $98 billion tax increase. It was mostly excise taxes on this and that and repealing certain business tax breaks, but preserving the entirety of the income tax rate cut. And it was supposed to be balanced, every dollar increase was supposed to be matched by a $3 cut in federal spending. So in other words, you had $98 billion in taxes and roughly $300 billion in spending cuts over the next 5 years. From Reagan's point of view, you're not only being fiscally responsible, but you're shrinking the government. And of course, the problem with the deal is Congress didn't live up to its end of the bargain. Most of the reviews said that every dollar of tax increase generated $1.15 of new spending, and Reagan later regretted the deal and said it was his biggest mistake. But you can see from his point of view why it made sense according to his own principles. And I think the foreign policy story is more straightforward, but also I think you see some consistency about Reagan. One of the things that other people have written about this, but I repeat it too, is in the second term, a lot of conservatives were absolutely apoplectic that Reagan was getting along with Gorbachev. They thought he was being hoodwinked. I think my very favorite was George Will, who was very close to President Reagan, and especially to Nancy. And the day the Intermediate Forces Treaty was signed in December 1987, that was the treaty for the first time eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. George Will wrote in his column, "Future historians will date today as the day the Cold War was lost." I've asked George about that quote and some others he made like it. He also said Reagan had elevated wishful thinking to a political philosophy. And George, to his credit, said, "I was wrong." He said, "Ronald Reagan turned out to know even more than I thought he did." Now, as I suggested earlier, on the surface, the reading of an old Reagan and a new Reagan seems plausible. But again, if you look closer, I think you see the fundamental consistency from day one to the last day in office. People remember, those of us my age remember, you younger folks need to read about this. His very first press conference, I think maybe his third day in office in January 1981, Sam Donaldson, the human bullhorn, pulls himself up to his full height in this very pompous way, says, "Mr. President, do you still believe that the Soviet Union is bent on world domination?" That was a phrase that liberals would use as thinking this was a trope of unserious conservatism. "Or, Mr. President, is it possible to have détente?" And the backdrop to this is that both Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger had told Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, "Don't worry about Reagan. Yeah, he talks tough, but once he's in office, he'll end up settling into détente pretty much like us." So Donaldson asked him that question, and Reagan says, every Soviet leader has reaffirmed that world domination is their goal, and furthermore, they believe it's perfectly moral for them to lie, cheat, and steal in the service of that goal. Reagan's own foreign policy people in the corner of the room are turning white, and there's a gasp from the press corps. It's like, oh my God, this is the same Ronald Reagan we've been hearing all these years. He actually is not going to change in office. At the same time, by the way, Ambassador Dobrynin used to have the special privilege of being able to drive in the underground parking lot of the State Department, take a special elevator up. He showed up the first week like he always had, and the guard at the gate says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ambassador, your privileges have been revoked. You've got to go in the front door with the ambassador from Botswana." There was a new gang in town. So this was very upsetting to the Soviet Union. In a private letter in 1983, Reagan wrote to a friend something interesting. Quote, "I've never believed in any negotiation with the Soviets that we could appeal to them as we could to people like ourselves." They're not like us, he's saying, right? "Negotiations with the Soviets is really a case of presenting a choice in which they face alternatives they must consider on the basis of cost. For example, in our arms reduction talks, they must recognize that failure to meet us on some mutually agreeable level will result in an arms race in which they know they cannot maintain superiority. They must choose between reduced equal levels or inferiority." Close. Well, that's some choice. Join us or die. I mean, it's not quite that stark. So that's the tough Reagan we know, the Reagan of the evil empire. On the other hand, as he was recovering from his shooting in 1981, Reagan wrote a long handwritten letter to Leonid Brezhnev. It was quite sentimental, and among other passages in it appears this. Is it possible that we have permitted ideology, political and economic philosophies, and governmental policies to keep us from considering the very real everyday problems of our peoples? Mr. President, should we not be concerned with eliminating the obstacles which prevent our people from achieving their most cherished goals? And isn't it possible that some of these obstacles are born of a government objectives which have little to do with the real need and desires of our people? Well, the letter appalled Richard Pipes, his senior advisor on Soviet affairs. Secretary of State Al Haig tried to keep him from sending it. Oddly enough, the State Department had drafted a response to him as a pro forma letter had come from Brezhnev that was very much tougher. If you'd read this letter and the other one, you would have thought that Reagan's letter came from the State Department or maybe Jimmy Carter. And the State Department letter had come from Reagan. It was the other way around. And Reagan ended up sending both letters, which is the compromise. And I gotta think that the Soviets found this deeply confusing. In 1981, to a reporter, Reagan said this, in December 1981, "I've always recognized that ultimately there's got to be a settlement, a solution with the Soviet Union. The other way, if you don't believe in a settlement, is that we're trapped in the back of our mind with the inevitability of conflict someday, and that kind of conflict is going to end the world." Now that's very similar to the attitude Churchill had in his famous speech about the Iron Curtain in Fulton, and also in his thoughts about how we need to reach a settlement. You know, late in World War II, you know, this would be like March into April, literally the last few weeks of the war in Europe, Churchill said to one of his aides, foreseeing the problems of post-war Europe and Eastern Europe, Churchill said, you know, if I can just talk to Stalin once a week, have dinner with Stalin once a week, there'll be no trouble at all after the war. Surely a complete misjudgment. But I think, by the way, entirely typical of the self-confidence of people who rise to these kinds of stations in politics. I think it explains why Barack Obama wants to sit down with the Iranians and anybody else. I think that's quite typical. Reagan used to say, early in his first term, you know, if I could just sit down with the Soviet leaders and calmly talk about our differences, I think we could make a breakthrough. Or he'd say, you know, if I could just get a Soviet leader in an airplane and fly him over an American neighborhood, the scales will fall from, he didn't quite put it this way, but the implication was, the scales will fall from his eyes when he realizes what a Mickey Mouse system they have. Which is what he thought. Reagan thought, you know, like, silly stuff. So as I say, this overconfidence in personal diplomacy is a trait. And in Gorbachev, he actually found someone he could talk to for real. The transcripts of their meetings really make for fascinating reading, even in the clunky sort of bureaucraties that the State Department note takers wrote down. For those of you really interested, some of the Soviet transcripts have been translated and are available, and they're actually better done than the American transcripts. Gorbachev, I came to the view, was in fact a genuine liberal reformer, although a deeply confused one. He thought the problems of socialism required more socialism, which is why he didn't get very far with it. I like to say that he was less Machiavelli than he was Inspector Clouseau when it came to reform at home in the Soviet Union. But he was someone Reagan could talk to for real, and Reagan noticed some things about him. And I think at their second meeting, the one in Reykjavik that was so dramatic, a couple of very interesting things happened there that were forgotten. Reagan says to him, you're the first Soviet leader that hasn't repeated the boilerplate about your object being worldwide Marxist revolution. Reagan says, I find that significant. I say in my book that this was very nearly the moment you could say the Cold War ended. Because Reagan goes on to say, you know, you want to have a two-party system in the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev mumbles a bit about it. We like our party system fine, and you know, yours, I suppose, works for you, and some of that usual relativistic nonsense. Reagan says, Reagan just keeps going, he says, furthermore, I think you ought to come to America and become a Republican. She just kept going at him like this, keeping him completely off stride. There was one other very interesting moment in that summit that everyone missed because, for those of you younger folks, this is the summit where Gorbachev sprung a surprise on Reagan. He said, we'll reduce nuclear weapons ultimately to zero if you'll give up the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Reagan wouldn't. And the whole summit thought to have collapsed in failure. It wasn't until later that people realized, well, wait a minute, they've offered these huge concessions, they really can't take them back now. That now becomes the basis for our agreements, which is how the subsequent history unfolded. But at the time, it was so dramatic and discouraging. People, first of all, our European allies thought Reagan was out of his mind to contemplate such a deal without talking to him. And most of the American press and Reagan's opponents thought Reagan was out of his mind not to have taken the deal and not to have given up the missile defense. But in the opening